The first gun went quiet in the middle of a sentence. The German radio operator was halfway through a calm, practiced report. Wind direction steady, targets marked, battery ready, when the words dissolved into a burst of static so sharp it made everyone in the dugout flinch. For a second there was only the low hum of equipment and the distant thunder of the front. Then another voice broke in, higher pitched, tight with confusion, asking if anyone had eyes on a fast, moving aircraft hugging the ground like a shadow that refused to lift. At first no one understood what was happening. Aircraft were expected to come from above, high and clean, leaving time to react, time to calculate, time to fire. This one didn't do that. It arrived beneath the cloud line, beneath expectations, beneath the carefully rehearsed responses that had worked 100 times before. It was flying so low that it seemed less like a machine in the sky and more like something skimming the earth itself, using hedgerows, tree lines, and folds in the ground as cover. A spotter near the first battery leaned out of his shelter just long enough to glimpse it. He didn't see markings, didn't count wings, or identify the model. What stayed with him was the sound, an engine note that didn't fade as it passed, only grew louder, deeper, until it felt like pressure in the chest. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, and that was when the rocket struck. The impact didn't arrive as a single explosion, but as a tearing sensation, like the ground itself was being unzipped. Earth leapt into the air. The gun crew vanished behind smoke and dirt. When the dust settled, the gun was no longer pointing anywhere. Its barrel was twisted, its shield peeled back, its crew either gone or silent. The radio wire lay severed, the handset hanging uselessly from a nail. Minutes later, another transmission cut out. This time it was Battery 3. The voice on the line had been arguing, irritated, almost dismissive, about the reports coming in. One aircraft couldn't possibly be responsible. Anti-aircraft units hadn't engaged because they hadn't seen anything worth shooting at. The pilot, whoever he was flying too low, too fast, too close. By the time you heard him, he was already past you. The message ended with a sudden shout, then nothing. By the time the third position went silent, the tone on the radio net had changed, orders overlapped, questions went unanswered, coordinates were repeated again and again, as if saying them enough times might bring the guns back to life. Someone finally said what everyone was thinking but hadn't wanted to admit. He's flying too low. We can't hit him. The aircraft wasn't supposed to survive this kind of work. Every manual said low-level attacks were suicidal. Small arms fire, machine guns, even pistols could reach you if you came in low enough, but the pilot seemed to understand something the manuals didn't. He never stayed in one place long enough to be aimed at. He appeared suddenly, almost casually, lining up with a battery from an angle that made range estimation useless, then vanished behind a stand of trees or a rise in the land before anyone could respond. From the ground, it felt unreal. Men who had endured weeks of artillery duels, who had learned to live with constant danger, found themselves staring at empty sky, listening for an engine that might already be gone. They fired anyway, sending tracers blindly into the air, knowing even as they pulled the trigger that it was too late. At the fourth position, a young officer tried something different. He ordered his men to hold fire, to wait until the aircraft committed to its run. He believed discipline would solve what panic could not. When the plane appeared, skimming just above the grass, the men waited, knuckles white on triggers. The officer shouted the command. The guns never fired. A rocket struck the ammunition stack before the order could be completed. The blast rolled through the position like a wave, lifting bodies, smashing equipment, erasing the careful calm the officer had tried to impose. When nearby units called for a status report, there was no one left to answer. By now, the radios carried more fear than information. Static filled the gaps where voices should have been. Someone counted the silent positions out loud, as if keeping track might stop the number from growing. 5, then 6. Each loss came faster than the last, not because the pilot was speeding up, but because resistance was collapsing inward on itself. Crews abandoned guns, leaving them untouched, hoping concealment would save them. Some ran, some froze. The aircraft returned again and again, always low, always precise. It didn't circle to admire its work. It didn't linger. It simply appeared, struck, and disappeared, like a metronome ticking down the remaining defenses. Smoke columns began to mark the countryside, thin at first, then thicker, until the horizon itself looked bruised. At the 7th position, a radio operator stayed at his post, even as the others fled. He kept transmitting updates no one had time to process. He described the sound, the direction, the altitude. He was still talking when the signal dissolved into a long, hollow hiss. The 8th battery never made contact at all. Recon later found the guns intact but abandoned, their crews scattered, convinced the next pass would be theirs. The fear of the unseen approach had done what explosives sometimes could not. The 9th position fell almost quietly. One final burst of radio chatter, confused, overlapping, desperate. Then silence settled across the net like a held breath. The sky above was empty again, peaceful enough that it felt like a trick. Long after the aircraft had gone, men emerged cautiously from cover. They walked among the wreckage, counting the guns that would not fire again, tracing the shallow scars in the earth where something impossibly fast had passed just overhead. They talked in low voices about the pilot, about how close he must have been, about how they never truly saw him until it was already over. The radios stayed on, their faint hum filling the space where commands used to be, carrying nothing now but the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous threat is the one that refuses to stay where you expect it to be. The silence that followed felt heavier than the bombardments that had come before it. Without the guns, the front seemed to hold its breath. Men waited for orders that never arrived, listening to radios that hissed softly, as if embarrassed by their own emptiness. Somewhere far behind the lines, officers demanded explanations, but those demands took time to travel, and time was something the forward units no longer trusted. Then the engine returned. It didn't announce itself loudly at first. It crept back into awareness as a vibration in the ground, a faint trembling that made loose dirt slide from sandbags. A sentry looked up, squinting into the pale sky, certain he had imagined it. The sound faded, then came again, stronger, closer, slicing through the air at an angle that made direction impossible to judge. "He's back," someone whispered, though no one needed to be told. This time, the aircraft didn't attack immediately. It passed low and fast, almost teasing, just enough to be seen. Men flinched and ducked, some firing reflexively, bullets chasing a shape that was already gone. The pilot was testing them now, measuring fear as carefully as fuel. In a command dugout several kilometers away, a senior officer gripped the edge of the table as reports trickled in. He had commanded artillery before. He knew what it took to silence guns, sustained bombardment, coordinated assaults, overwhelming force. This was different. One aircraft moving alone, undoing hours of preparation in minutes. He ordered anti-aircraft teams to redeploy, to spread out, to watch the ground as much as the sky. But the pilot seemed to know that too. When the attack came, it didn't target the obvious guns or command posts. It went after the in-between spaces. The trucks waiting with shells, the crews resting near tree lines, the observation points that fed information to the batteries. Each strike peeled away another layer of coordination, leaving the remaining units blind and isolated. A radio operator tried to warn a nearby position, shouting over the roar as the aircraft approached. His words tangled, his voice cracking with urgency, the message cut out mid-syllable, replaced by the unmistakable sound of impact transmitted through the line itself. Those listening felt it in their bones. On the ground, men began to realize the pattern too late. The pilot always came from the sun or from behind terrain, always exited toward cover, never climbing until he was safely out of range. The aircraft's shadow flashed across fields and roads, a fleeting stain that seemed to drag panic along with it. Someone fired a flare in desperation, illuminating nothing but drifting smoke. At one surviving battery, a gunner finally managed to track the aircraft long enough to fire. The shells burst behind it close enough to feel like hope. For a moment cheers rose, thin and brittle. Then the aircraft dipped even lower, disappearing entirely from view, and the cheers died in embarrassed silence. Seconds later, rockets slammed into the gun position from an angle no one had expected. The attack wasn't just physical anymore, it was psychological. Men began to anticipate the sound, jumping at every distant engine, every passing truck. Sleep became impossible. Even when the sky was empty, it felt watched, as if the aircraft might reappear the moment attention drifted. By afternoon, the radio net was a map of fear. Some units transmitted constantly, afraid that silence would mean they had already been written off. Others went quiet on purpose, hoping invisibility would protect them. Neither approach worked for long. In one trench line, an experienced sergeant tried to steady his men. He spoke calmly, reminding them that aircraft needed fuel, that pilots were human, that no machine could stay aloft forever. His words were reasonable, measured, and utterly ineffective. When the engine note returned, rising quickly, even he pressed himself into the dirt. The aircraft swept along the line without firing, close enough that men could see the blur of its wings, the flicker of exhaust. For an instant, time seemed to slow. Some later swore they saw the pilot's helmet, the slight tilt of the plane as it corrected course. Then it was gone, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt staged. That silence broke with news from the rear. Ammunition convoys had halted. Routes were being rerouted, delayed, second-guessed. Commanders hesitated to move guns into exposed positions, fearing they would simply become the next targets. The absence of artillery fire on the front was noticed immediately by the opposing side, and pressure began to build. The damage spread outward, ripple by ripple. As evening approached, smoke hung low over the fields, catching the light in soft, deceptive colors. The aircraft did not return for several hours. Some dared to believe it had been driven off. Others knew better. They understood now that the pilot chose his moments carefully, that absence could be as unsettling as presence. When darkness fell, the radios remained on. Operators sat hunched over them, listening to the static, flinching at every change in tone. No one spoke above a murmur. Somewhere beyond the line, an engine idled, or perhaps it didn't. It was impossible to tell anymore, and in that uncertainty, with 9 artillery positions already reduced to silence, the realization settled in slowly and painfully. The damage done could not be undone by morning, even if the aircraft never returned. Morning came without clarity. The light crept in low and pale, revealing the same broken ground, the same abandoned equipment, now stripped of the drama of night and left looking almost ordinary. Smoke still rose in thin threads, stubborn and slow, marking where the guns had stood. Birds returned first, tentative, circling above places men avoided. The war had paused just long enough to make the damage visible. The radios crackled again, not with panic this time, but with something worse, hesitation. Voices asked whether positions were still viable, whether guns should be moved, whether roads were safe. Each question carried an unspoken fear. If we move, will he see us? Some crews tried anyway. A column of trucks rolled cautiously along a sunken road, tarps pulled tight over ammunition crates. Drivers kept their speed low, eyes flicking constantly to the sky. The engine noise felt too loud, too revealing. When the first truck reached an open stretch, the men relaxed just slightly, enough to be human again. That was when the shadow crossed the road. The aircraft came in from behind a rise, so low its passage flattened grass in its wake. There was no warning shot, no dramatic dive. Rockets struck the lead truck, lifting it sideways, spilling its cargo in a scatter of metal and flame. The rest of the column braked hard, some vehicles colliding, others veering into ditches. Men ran, slipping on gravel, dropping helmets and rifles in their rush to disappear. The aircraft did not chase them. It never did. It destroyed what it came for and left the rest to their fear. News of the ambush traveled faster than orders ever had. Within an hour, movement along the sector slowed to a crawl. Guns that could still fire were left without shells. Infantry units waited for support that would not arrive. Command posts filled with maps marked by red pencil lines that no longer meant what they once had. A staff officer tried to put numbers to the problem. He spoke of sortie rates, of fuel consumption, of how long a single aircraft could realistically maintain this tempo. His calculations were sound. No one argued with them, but when he finished, the room remained quiet. Numbers did not erase the memory of radios cutting out mid-sentence. Out on the line, men learned to listen differently. They stopped trusting their eyes and began trusting their instincts. A sudden stillness in the air made shoulders tense. A distant engine tractor or truck sent heads ducking. Even the wind through trees sounded suspicious now, too much like approach, too much like warning. In one foxhole, two soldiers argued softly about whether the pilot was alone. One insisted there had to be more aircraft, that no single man could be everywhere at once. The other shook his head. He had watched the attacks, noted the timing, the angles. "It's one," he said quietly. "One who knows exactly where we are." By midday, attempts were made to adapt. Guns were dragged under tree cover, camouflaged with branches and netting. Anti-aircraft teams were placed closer to the front, told to fire without waiting for orders. Everyone watched the sky. The aircraft came anyway. It ignored the obvious traps, sliding past them as if uninterested. Instead, it struck a concealed battery that had believed itself invisible. The rockets punched through foliage and earth, finding metal beneath. The men there never understood how they had been seen. The radio operator managed a single word, "impossible," before his transmission ended. That word echoed through the network, repeated with bitter humor by those who heard it. As afternoon stretched on, fatigue set in. Fear is exhausting when it never resolves into action. Men slumped against trench walls, radios resting heavily on their laps. They waited for the sound, almost welcoming it, because waiting had become worse than being attacked. Late in the day, the aircraft passed overhead without firing. It flew even lower than before, so close that the rush of air rattled loose equipment. Men pressed flat, feeling the heat of the engine wash over them. For a heartbeat, it felt intimate, personal, as if the pilot were reminding them he could return at any moment. Then the sky was empty again. That night, fires were forbidden. Cigarettes were smoked under blankets. Conversation stayed close to the ground, voices barely louder than breathing. Radios murmured endlessly, a fragile thread connecting units that no longer trusted distance. Somewhere beyond the front, the pilot landed, refueled, checked his aircraft. Or perhaps he didn't. Perhaps he stayed aloft, circling, listening, deciding. No one on the ground could know, and that ignorance pressed down harder than any bomb. By the time darkness settled fully, the men understood something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just that 9 artillery positions were silent. It was that certainty itself had been stripped away. The sky was no longer something above them. It was something that watched, waited, and descended without warning. And every radio, still humming softly in the night, seemed to agree. The next day unfolded without a clear beginning. There was no trumpet of dawn, no sudden rush of orders. Instead, everything moved slowly, as if the front itself were unsure how to proceed. Men woke stiff and half-rested, radios already murmuring beside them, the static now as familiar as breathing. Someone joked quietly that the radios sounded nervous too. No one laughed. Reports came in fragments. A gun repositioned overnight but never fired. A convoy turned back after spotting a shadow that may or may not have been real. An observation post abandoned because the sky felt wrong. Each message, taken alone, meant little. Together, they formed a pattern of shrinking confidence. By mid-morning, higher command issued a firm directive. Artillery was to resume firing at scheduled intervals. The order was meant to restore normalcy, to prove that the front was still under control. Crews read the message, looked at one another, and nodded. They prepared the guns carefully, deliberately, as if precision might invite mercy. The first shell fired cleanly, the familiar recoil shuddering through the ground. A second followed. For a moment, relief spread, thin but real. The system still worked, the gun still spoke. Then the engine note cut across the air. It was closer than expected, sharper, sliding in beneath the sound of outgoing fire. Men froze, hands still on breeches and elevation wheels, eyes snapping skyward. Someone shouted a warning that came too late to matter. The aircraft appeared from behind a line of trees, so low that it seemed to burst out of the earth itself. The rockets struck with brutal accuracy. One hit the gun's trail, snapping it like a twig. Another tore through the crew shelter, collapsing it inward. The third landed just beyond the position, showering the survivors with dirt and fragments. When the smoke cleared, the gun lay crippled, useless. Its brief defiance ended. The radio report that followed was short and strained. No embellishment, no panic. Just confirmation that another gun would not fire again. Something broke after that. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, inside the men who listened. They had followed orders. They had done everything correctly. And still the aircraft had come. Still it had struck exactly where it needed to. The lesson was impossible to ignore. As the afternoon wore on, the aircraft's presence became intermittent, unpredictable. It struck twice in quick succession, then vanished for hours. Each absence made men tense rather than relax. They no longer trusted patterns. They understood now that the pilot set the rhythm, not them. In one battered command post, an officer removed his headphones and rubbed his temples. He stared at the map in front of him, at the neat symbols representing units that no longer existed in any meaningful way. He realized that he was planning for a battlefield that had already changed shape. Out on the line, a veteran loader sat beside his gun, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the sky. He had served long enough to recognize fear when it stopped being loud. This was the quiet kind, the kind that settled in and rearranged your thinking. He found himself imagining the pilot, not as an enemy abstraction, but as a person making decisions, choosing angles, choosing moments, that made it worse. Late in the afternoon, anti-aircraft fire finally found its mark, or so it seemed. A burst exploded close to the aircraft's path, close enough that men cheered despite themselves. For a fraction of a second, hope flared again. The aircraft dipped, adjusted, and continued on its way. The cheers died instantly, replaced by an embarrassed hush. No one spoke of it again. As evening approached, the attack slowed. The aircraft made one last pass, low and fast, without firing. It crossed the line from end to end, a deliberate sweep, its engine echoing across fields and trenches. Men watched it go, some standing now instead of crouching, too tired to react properly. When the sound finally faded, it left behind a strange emptiness, not relief, not victory, just space where certainty used to be. That night, radios stayed alive with soft chatter. Units checked in with one another simply to confirm they still existed. Voices sounded older, flatter. Someone asked how many guns were still operational. No one answered directly. Far to the rear, planners worked late, drafting reports that tried to capture what had happened in proper terms. They spoke of disruption, of effective low-altitude interdiction, of psychological impact. The words were accurate and completely inadequate. On the ground, men did not use such language. They spoke instead about the sound, about how close it flew, about how the sky itself no longer felt neutral. They spoke about how a single aircraft had taught them to be afraid of open space. When the radios finally quieted in the early hours, it was not because things were calm, but because there was nothing left to say. The front lay exposed, altered, waiting for whatever would come next, and above it all, the sky remained wide and empty, offering no promise that it would stay that way.